All right, and welcome everybody to another Saturday discussion brought to you by Code Newbie. This week we actually have something that I am so not familiar with that I am enjoying it. We have LinemanJS with Courteney Ervin, and it's interesting that Courteney actually describes herself as a Ruby developer. So I don't feel like I'm going to be that much confused because I'm coming at it from another perspective as well. So for those that are wanting to dabble in JavaScript but aren't sure, how their allegiance will lie with their other programming languages, fear not, because I think Courtney's going to explain how that's going to work. And without further ado, Courtney, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jay. So I'm really excited to be here. My name is Courteney Ervin. I'm a software engineer with Code Montage, which is a small startup that focuses on open source code. And today I'm going to be talking about LinemanJS. And LinemanJS is a really great kind of lightweight framework to create JavaScript front-end applications. So if you've heard about technologies like Angular or Ember or Backbone, if you've come across them and thought about, should I learn them? Should I not learn them? Lineman is a great starting point to kind of start to understand how you create an application in JavaScript before you commit to one or another framework, larger framework, and it really incorporates well with those frameworks so that you can always move forward into them. So part of the reason why JavaScript front-end applications are really popular right now is because people are kind of transitioning from big applications like a Rails application to something that has sort of a core API, and then you have multiple different front ends. So that's how you can have Facebook, which has all of its data held in one place, and then it has a native iPhone app and a native Android app, and also the web presence. So I think it's kind of important to know more JavaScript now and to understand how to create applications that are scalable, that can be quite large on the front end, while connecting to a core API on the back end. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we might do that in Lineman today. Let's see. And one thing that makes Lineman really nice is that it's very, very lightweight and it has great documentation. It's really good for prototyping, as we'll see in a couple of minutes. And it has a really nice, easy development setup where you can run your tests and check your syntax and all sorts of things all at once. And we'll look at each of these elements in a little bit more detail. But first things you need to know is in order to install Lineman, you need to have Node.js installed. And then you use the NPM, the Node package manager, to pull in the LinemanJS files. So I already have that installed on my computer, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see how that looks. Okay, so in order to start the Lineman framework, or to create a new Lineman application, you want to do Lineman new and then the name of your application. And I thought today, since it's early October and Halloween is coming up, it might be nice to create just a simple kind of Halloween scavenger hunt app where you can find a list of things to find for Halloween and cross them off as you go, as you see them. So in order to create the directory for that application, I would say Lineman new Halloween, and it would create the directory. I've actually already done this. So we're just going to change directory into the Lineman app.
That's interesting that it has that built-in, just I guess like project management function. I mean, that's something that I know is really popular in Python and Django. I'm not sure if they have that is that a Rails thing or?
So wait, I'm sorry, you mean just creating the application?
Right, just because I know that usually the way that some of these smaller frameworks work it'll set it up so that a lot of the requirements are built in, and instead of you having to go and add all of these different things, you can usually just add one simple command and it does all that for you. Python, we have something that's basically like a virtual environment where you can install all your dependencies and everything else. And if you're using something like virtual env wrapper, you can have like actual scripts you can run, as you activate or deactivate a project. And I just think it's interesting that Lineman would do that. I've actually never heard of any language, I've heard of like Ruby having something similar to that, and I've heard of, and of course like Python and Django, but I didn't know that JavaScript was kind of going into that arena as well.
Yeah, so that's what's really nice about this, is that it kind of creates a little bit of a light framework, and I would say that if Python has either Flask or Django as kind of the leading options for creating a web application, with Flask being lightweight and Django being heavyweight, I would say, or Ruby has Sinatra and Rails, I would say that Lineman is closer to the Flask or Sinatra side of things. And it really does create a full directory for you and set up a lot of different options so that you don't have to take the time and energy to do those configurations. And it gives you a lot of different things that you wouldn't have normally. And usually with JavaScript, you don't have that. You kind of have to create the .js files yourself, do any configuration yourself, install any vendor scripts yourself, because it's all loaded into the HTML.
Right, and I think that's where I was getting at, is I knew that the other programming languages had something that you can just go and you can say, Flask this app, and it's going to give you all of your dependencies. It's going to give you all of your prereqs. But I've never heard of a JavaScript app that does that. And that could just be because I'm not too familiar with JavaScript, and when I do usually use it, it's like either Node or like vanilla. And
yeah, it's really nice. It's beginning to give you that structure, that you wouldn't have otherwise. So it's like a new sort of look at that. And I think that when you do create front-end applications with something like Angular or Ember directly, you have the capacity to develop applications immediately. But JavaScript is definitely moving in that direction.
Nice, that's interesting. That's definitely good to hear.
Yeah. So we've created our application and we have all these files now. And so I think the best thing to do would be to show some of the options that you have. So much like Rails, you have to run a server in order to get your lineman to create the application. And essentially what's happening is Lineman depends heavily on a tool called Grunt. And Grunt is a tool that will run JavaScript tasks for you. And that's kind of the same thing that Rails or Python does, is that it has all of these steps that it does for you prior to pulling in your source code. So Lineman runs all of these steps for you using Grunt. And it also has the steps configured, which you would have to do yourself if you tried to use Grunt directly. So I think one nice thing we might want to do is run the server. So we'll do lineman run is that command. And it starts up a server for us. And you can see down here, it says the web server is generated on port 8000. So what I think we should do is create a new tab, and we can essentially go to localhost 8000 and see what our application looks like right now. So it's just a simple hello world application. And this is what they kind of give you to start with. And then over here, I just want to move this down a little bit out of the way. And then the other thing I want to do is to show us the tests. So let's do lineman spec and see how the tests run. And you can see that there's another window popping up, and we have one single test, one spec running, hello test, and it specs the results of a method to be hello world. And you can see down here, this test is complete. And as we move forward, as long as we keep this tab open, it will continue to run our tests as we code. So we can do test-driven development without having to set up or run our specs regularly. It will just do it anytime that the source code changes. So really nice little feature. And then with our server running, I think now would be a great time to kind of look at our code itself. So what did we get in this package? So there are a lot of different files. I would say some of the best places to start are to look at the README, which it gives you just a nice little empty README that we can change. up here in the generated, this is where Lineman is going to compile the application, so we don't have to mess with anything in the generated section. It's just going to shrink down your source code into single files that'll be pulled into your application. And then your specs are down here. So here's our one test created using Jasmine. So all of these different JavaScript libraries have been pulled together to allow you to use them easily without having to do all of that work and effort yourself. And then here in the application itself, we have the areas where we can create our code. So a JS folder, CSS, and this should look similar to any Rails or Django framework, or any app that you've made yourself with just HTML and JavaScript and CSS. And here we have this config folder. And this is where you can make any changes to the bare bones Lineman configuration. And one of the nicest things to look at is this application.js in the config folder. So you'll have API proxying, which is essentially being able to connect your front-end JavaScript application to any Rails, Sinatra, Flask, Python, any back-end server that you'd like. So we talked about microservices and having this kind of core API that serves out to very different devices. And this would be where you connect to that back-end core API. Right here, you would uncomment out this server code and set it up. Right now, it's set up to the Rails port 3000. And then down here, there's this option called Live Reload, which actually allows you to automatically reload the browser every time that you make a change to the code, so you don't have to go through that process yourself. If you've ever developed with JavaScript before, you know that you have to consistently reload the browser to reload your JavaScript every time you make a change. Now, essentially, Lineman will listen for any changes that you make and then reload the browser itself. And the only thing we need to do is uncomment this line, save the file, and then restart our server. So and so now it's listening, and as long as we reload our application, it will listen for any changes that we make. So we should see our changes directly happening. Okay, so we have our live reload. Let's just quickly change our README to our Halloween scavenger hunt. And let's save those changes, and then we can close both of these files. And let's look at how the application shows code. So instead of having HTML pages, Lineman uses a syntax called underscore. So that's this .us on this file. But inside, you'll see that it looks just like your usual HTML setup with, it pulls in your CSS right here, it pulls in your JavaScript down here. And in the body, I think the best thing to do would be to just create what we would want our Halloween scavenger hunt to look like. So let's say we have an H1, a header that just says the name of the application. And a div for our content. And the reason why, in fact, let's do ID. The reason why I'm creating this div with the content option ID is because as we're making this one-page application, we're not going to have the different pages be reloaded. We're going to just make changes directly to the DOM, so directly here in this document. And so I want to be able to access everything that will change. So this is essentially our header. It might be a logo. It might be something that's static on the page. It might include a navigation bar. And then here you would have anything that is changeable, anything that is dependent on events. I'm going to throw another item in here, which is going to be our list of different things that we need to find. And then we'll include some list items with the class item. And let's say we want to find 5 jack-o'-lanterns. 2 ghosts,
You got to
4
include bags of candy corn.
4 pirates, 7 bags of candy, and let's see, and 1 Beyonce costume, because why not, right? I'm sorry, I'm just going to take off my split here. Okay, so this is our short list, and the thing is that if we created this application and shared it with people, we would have to change this list all the time, right? And there's a point where we want to start thinking about, I mean, this is a very simple example, but we may want to start thinking about, okay, how could we add items to this list? How could we change items to this list inside of our application? And the way that front-end JavaScript works is that you think about items in terms of their front-end element. So, you know, the view is very important, and each and every item on the view has JavaScript related to it, and it kind of has its own model and view and controller or presenter that connects the model and the view. So we're going to start thinking about kind of objects, but related to the front end instead of related to the back end and data the way that we normally do. So here's our automatically reloaded scavenger hunt page. And while we're at it, why don't we look at this hello world and how it's occurring so that we can kind of remove it from the page. So here's where the hello world takes place. And we have a function that's just returning the string hello world. And then we have another function that's taking this JST object and passing it an object that's just text, which returns, which links to this function here, right? So text, which points to this function, which returns hello world, and then adds it to the HTML in the body. And essentially, this is just an event listener that listens to the code itself. And the reason why it looks like this is because there's no jQuery in our application right now. So I think what we might want to do now is just add some jQuery. So let's do, so here on this, in this terminal, I'm just going to use Lineman to grab jQuery really quickly. So I'm going to do Lineman fetch jQuery. And it installs jQuery like that. So I don't have to find jQuery online and copy and paste it into a file and include it in my folders. Lineman will go ahead and do it for me. And when we look in our vendor code now, we'll see jQuery.js as well. So that's great. And if you've used jQuery before, you're probably used to this setup. In fact, we don't even need to pass it a function. We have the function, which is hello. So all of that code that we saw before was the non-jQuery version of doing this. And as we can see, our page looks the same. And if we wanted to change the text that it said, we might say hello code newbie, for example. Save. And when we go back to the page, it automatically reloads. Okay, great. So we don't really need this though. This is just a great way to kind of get a sense of how it works. Here we have a template. So again, an underscore file that we're passing an object into to create a dynamic page that changes as we go. So I'm going to comment this code out actually, and you should see our tests fail immediately as we start to, as we comment this out. So down here it's rerunning. And I want to start thinking about how we can make this more dynamic and use some of this functionality to create a more dynamic web application. So as we start thinking about these elements, we have this header, which isn't going to change, is very static. And then we have this list of items, jack-o'-lanterns, ghosts, pirates. And each of these items, this list of items is an element in and of itself, right? The items on the list are each an element. And then there's also the div, the content div that holds everything, is kind of an invisible aspect of this. So what I want to do first is create a nice application.js file, and here we see it's failed because we commented out the code. And I'm just going to delete the test because we don't need it. And we can stop running the tests, but just know that if you wanted to do test-driven development, you could. Okay, so over here, we will create an application.js app.js file. We can go ahead and open that here. All right, so essentially what we want to do is translate this front end into some JavaScript objects. So one such JavaScript object will be the application itself, which is all of the front end application that may be changing, that people may be clicking on items for. Or actually, and let's make that static. And we'll initialize that with a function that grabs the item as a jQuery object, so this element, and sets it equal to the jQuery content ID. And then also let's grab the list. And finally, we should return the element just in case we need it in the future. Okay. So we've created this overarching application object so that nothing is just out in the window. It's all held inside of this object. And the last thing that we need to do is make sure that we load it. You can see here, I'm also getting JS lint for free. So it's essentially reading through my files and telling me when I have syntax errors as well. So it's a great place to kind of get started writing JavaScript because you have all these tools to help support your syntax as well. So I'm missing a semicolon here, and I'm sure I'll be missing many as we move forward. Like I said, I'm a Ruby developer, so when it comes to the semicolons, I get a little forgetful.
I can definitely understand that.
Yeah, just what are these even for? Okay, so I've added some semicolons. It looks like we're running okay now. There's no lint on my files. We can see down here. And we're going to go ahead and start thinking about how we create the other elements of the application. So the first thing that we need is these items in the actual list. And we have 5 jack-o'-lanterns, 2 ghosts. Okay, so each of these items is sort of a bit of data. And we want to be able to add new items and think about other items and represent each item accurately. And now, if you're used to creating MVC applications or you've created anything in Rails, you're kind of thinking, okay, this is a model. This is some data that we need to hold on to, that we may need to change or alter, and we need to directly access it. So let's just go ahead and create a model. So I'm going to create another file called item, and I'll use that to create my model. So let's see. Nope. Function item. And the item will take some data, and it'll essentially give you a couple of attributes that you can access. So one would be the quantity. And one would be the description or the name. Let's just go with name, even though you might want to change that later. Okay. So quantity and name are looking good on our files. And the other thing that we want to think about doing is how do we initialize the data that we already have here? And I think the best way to do that for now is just to add it to our application. So our application will have an items array, and we'll set that up to have some So let's see, what do we have here? Yeah, lots of syntax errors when I'm in the middle of something. Let's see. Oops, I don't want to delete it just yet. I just want to see it. So we have 5 jack-o'-lanterns, 2, 4, 7, and 1. And over here we'll do Beyonce, bags of candy, pirates, ghosts, and jack-o'-lanterns. All right, so we have our items. They're being held in our application, and let's just confirm that that's the case. So in our console, we just want to make sure that we have this top level application object. That's great. And when we test items, it gives us this list of objects that we've created. And when we test the element itself, we also get this div aspect of the HTML returned as a jQuery object. So this is all awesome. It looks like our application is getting off to a great start. And the next thing that we want to do is make sure that we have a way to turn these items into actual item objects. So let's give this a function, create items. And let's pass the function a list of items. We're going to use underscore now, which is a really great library that gives you some of the things that in Ruby would be called enumerable methods. I'm not sure what they're referred to as in Python. Jay, maybe you have a better sense, but just being able to play around and iterate through a list of items. So we'll take these items, we'll create a variable to hold them when they're done. And maybe we shouldn't call it item, so let's call it item list. We'll say for each thing in items, do a function, and inside of the function we'll refer to it as items. And this is kind of, if you haven't seen underscore before, but we see JavaScript, it's kind of for item in items. This is the same sort of a thing. And we'll say item. What we want to do is create a new item with that item data. So we've seen this before. And we want to push that new item into our item list. So that we can return at the end this full item list. So now we should be able to create items and turn them into their own variable. So this should have its own items. The application should have a list of items, and that the list of items equals a function call that has the items data. And one thing about this is that I've got some naming mistakes here. So let's call this item list. So let's make sure that this works. Open our console again. Oh, create items is not defined. Make sure we call the actual function inside of the object. Items is not defined. This is like a normal and natural part of, here we go. Make sure we stay in the object. Great. So app exists, and we should be able to say app items and get a list of item objects. So app item list. We called it, that's why. Make sure it's not a jQuery object. Oh, running into some errors here. this create items. We need to make sure we return the item list. JavaScript, why? Here we go. Okay, so now we have a list of items. So we've created a model for these list of things so that we can add new items, we can move them around, we can add some additional functionality. And now we just need to be able to make sure that we can actually add them to the page so that they no longer exist in the actual static HTML. They will actually exist and be created at the time that we initialize the app. So in order to do that, we need a template. As we see here, we have a template that we're passing an object into. So we need to be able to pass our item object into the JavaScript template. So first, let's create a template. And again, this is with the underscore ending here. And we do have some, looks like we do have some syntax errors. So let me just fix those. There we go. 3 files lint free.
So many semicolons.
So many, why? I mean, and the other thing is that some people don't use semicolons, and if that's your practice, you may want to change the configuration of the JS hint. But I think it's helpful to know where they should go and to get used to typing your JavaScript in whatever way you think works best for you. Okay, so we have this, we're gonna make a template, so let's make sure we open the template for the item. And now we can essentially just copy this HTML that we wrote before into here. And it uses a very Rails or ERB type of style. So instead of 5 jack-o'-lanterns, we'll go back to our item and essentially grabbing directly from our item model, we'll say quantity space name. So using this data, directly pulling it in, and this will work for each of our lists as long as we can connect it. But at the moment, we haven't connected them. We're still depending on this, we were still depending on those list items. And when we go back to our actual application, we'll see that we don't have any more list items. So now we have a view, we have a model, and now we need the controller or presenter to connect between them and initialize in our application. So let's go ahead and create that particular file, and we're separating it out for the sake of sanity of the next person to deal with our Halloween scavenger hunt application. So we'll call that, I'm gonna call it item view, and that's gonna be a nice JavaScript file. We can close some of these things. So see, we're not gonna, we can make sure we depend on this so we can look at how this looks. And okay, our model, our template is done. Let's just open our item view. Our item view is going to be a new model, well, not model, constructor function called item view. It's going to take a particular item or whatever that model may be. So in this case, it's an item. And we will do, we'll set some variables. So this item equals item. And then we need to set the template as well. So this template equals JavaScript template. Oops. And then we need to send in the string for where their template is so that it can find the HTML that is going to use as a template for each item. And in this case, it's item.us. That's great. And then the last thing that the item view needs is a function to render each item. So let's make sure we do item view. We're going to add a function to the prototype of item view that connects our model to our view. In this case, it will create an element, which is going to be a jQuery function or a jQuery object that is equal to the template itself if it's given the object that is the item. This is a little confusing to parse out, so let's think about each part. When we looked at hello, we passed this object of text equals hello text function, which is essentially just this string, right? We passed the object as an argument into the template that we wanted it to use. So here in this case, we're going to pass the object that is our item model, which has the quantity and the name, into the template, which is our template. It needs the quantity and the name, and it will render it. It's going to create the jQuery element, the HTML and the jQuery, and well, the HTML that we will then turn into a jQuery element for being included. So we want to make sure that the render function returns the element that it needs. Okay, missing a bunch of semicolons or one, great. Okay, so we have this view option now, and the last thing we need to do is make sure that we can load those items into our actual application. So let's create a load items function that takes an array of items. And in this case, we think of items. Here, when we were thinking items, we were talking about item data. And we're talking about turning that raw item data into item models inside of our application. Here, when we talk about load items, we're saying let's take these actual item models, an array of item models, and turn them into HTML that we can inject into our page. So we'll say, items, item list HTML equals, or actually, let's just directly append them. So what we'll do is say for each of the items in the item list, we want to create a new item view to connect it to what it should look like. Our naming is getting pretty hairy here, so I expect some errors soon. And then we also want to create we want to then append that to our existing list. So this .list.append item view.render. So this may seem really complicated, and there's probably a much more direct way to do this, but what it does is it allows you to create an architecture for your application that's extendable, that's not going to cause too much duplication to occur, and that you can really build on in a nice way. So what Lineman is allowing us to do is really explore creating that model view controller arrangement by allowing us to have all of the sort of additions that we might need to create better code, to add semicolons. And one last thing that I'm missing here on this underscore function is a bind to this, which you pass into each underscore function. So we're creating a new item, we're appending it to our view, we're rendering it, and the last thing we need to do is load it. So we'll call before we create it with our item list. Okay, so let's see how that works out for us. Nope, item list is not defined. Same old, gotta make sure I'm in the right scope. This .template is not a function.
I think it's templates, not template.
Oh, Where here?
In your directory, it's app/templates, not template.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. This is why pair programming is awesome. There we go. Okay. So now we have these dynamically created options for ourselves. And this doesn't really show us everything, but we can say your quantity, 3, name, candy corn, packages, and syntax errors. We have this nice list. And when we start thinking about how we want our users to interact with it, in our actual item view, we would add any kind of interactive or events-based functionality. So in this case, we might want to set a clicker. So set a click listener so that when people click on the item, it immediately crosses it off. And it will add a function so that when it's clicked, we say this we can grab that target object and say target toggle the class add all my semicolons. And let's just add in our CSS here a nice little found class that will text decorate with a line through. So it'll strike it out as we click. And let's see if that works out for us in terms of automatically loading. In this case, we may need to reload because of the event.
And I was gonna ask, does the CSS trigger reload as well? And I'm seeing that now running concat app CSS. That's really interesting.
Yeah, so it reloads all of your assets. So it reloads your CSS, your JavaScript, the HTML. It should automatically reload. My bigger issue here is that it's not listening to my event. We're so close. Okay, we're really close, and I'm like, let's see, on the click, it should take this function, pass it the event, and the event target should toggle with the class found. And all of this reloading should happen. Programming, so hard. Why is it so hard? Here's why, because I actually have to set the listener when I create the element. So let's make sure we call the actual function that we created before we return the element itself. And now it should immediately reload so we can actually cross out items as we find them. And so in terms of code organization, we put this set click listener here inside of the item view. We could add other listeners. We could add other elements to the page that would have their own models and views and controllers or presenters, which might be, you know, a search list or an element that allowed you to log in or things like that. So you want to think more visually when you're thinking about how to break down a front-end JavaScript app. And then the last thing that we might want to do, let's say our list isn't so great, but we found a great API that pulls in scavenger hunt lists. We could then go back to our application configuration and set up an API proxy. And with a little Sinatra or Flask application or even a larger Rails application, we could connect to that API that we found. So that's my introduction to LinemanJS and to kind of some of the ways to think about using it as a learning tool and as a supportive JavaScript development environment.
I was gonna say let's break down that. Have you used it in any active projects?
Yeah, let me just switch over. So I have a project that I've been mostly using it for toy applications, but I have a project called Hearted It that is essentially a way to sort through Twitter favorites and do it by searching the actual text and things like that. And I've been mostly using it there and enjoying it. I think that the other great thing about it is that the same way that we fetched jQuery, you could fetch Angular, you could fetch Ember, and have some basic setup and a nice dev environment for doing kind of a different kind of development.
And I like that. I think that to me that's the biggest benefit of using Lineman so far that I've seen is even you compared it to Flask. Flask doesn't build your templates out. It doesn't build your CSS. Django, I want to say does, but at the same time, I do believe that this is really a good middle ground between the two. I mean, obviously from the JS perspective, and that's great because one of my Python applications I've been looking at, like, I really need to revise this front end. How is that going to work?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it allows you to separate it out. And for me, as a Rails developer, you get used to all of this kind of support and like just all of this sort of undergirding that happens quietly, silently in the background. And Lineman is like that, but without the weight or heft or even the number of like decisions that are made for you as Rails makes for you.
Nice. And how has your application, is that built in Rails and then just served via Lineman?
Yeah, so I'm using the JavaScript for all of the front-end interface that allows you to really directly interact with the application, which is very ugly right now. It's still in like pre-mode, but it also it's connected to a Sinatra application that doesn't do much and probably won't do much and is essentially just like a shell for the Twitter API because the JavaScript can't directly connect to it.
And that's a whole nother interesting idea there of hey, I know that my JavaScript will not be strong enough to do this, but I have this over here that might, and I know that I'm going to need JavaScript, so let me do this the way I know how, and then when it comes to serving the JavaScript, I'll worry about that. I'll let Lineman handle that for me.
I mean, it's a real separation of concerns. I think it has to. For me, it was like kind of getting to a place where I wanted to think about design and how do you structure things and why were some of the decisions that are kind of built into Rails made. And so it gives you the opportunity to really make decisions, which is something that is a little difficult if you're just starting out and just starting to learn, to find places where you can make architecture and design decisions and evaluate them.
Yeah, I think that's always been the biggest crux to, or like the biggest, I guess, handicap to my development is I have this back end that does all this great stuff. Now I want to do all these great things on the front end as well without destroying my back end.
Yeah. And like where do the different parts go? And as we start to use, I mean, people are using so many different devices now, like the front end, and people are interacting, very heavily with the front end, and you can't make all those decisions in the back end. It's really like we have to start rethinking how we structure things in a way that makes sense for developers.
And you said something really great at like part of the way in. You said, we're keeping it simple for the next developer that's going to look at this. And I think that this is where Lineman really, really excels, because not only is that broken down and everything is set up and you're not wondering like, okay, why did he do this here? And I know that's all template based, and that's great. And that's something that I would highly recommend, especially for newbies. Get behind a templating application. It will save you so much time. Even just as simple as, hey, I have this Django app and I'm building each page statically. Don't do that. No, build a base template. Don't copy and paste. Just start loading things into a template.
Yeah.
But with that, you're also keeping your back end very, very simple by doing this. You're allowing the the Ruby app or the Flask app. You're allowing that main source of code to be very, very, very lightweight. And I mean, I learned that lesson the hard way. I had to like shrink down 300 lines of code, and eventually, once I started learning about templating and how to say, okay, this module needs to do one thing and one thing only, and if it's doing 7 things, that's bad. And as much as it hurt to do that, eventually I shrunk my code down to about 40 line code. So,
wow.
When you take out 260 lines just by making things simpler, then you're doing the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, deleting code is such a good feeling in some ways. It's so hard at first, but once you start doing it, you're like, oh yeah, like this is going to be lean and mean. And I think that what this allows you to do is to think about templating, get behind something like underscore, better understand how templates work beyond whatever maybe your first programming language is, and lighten things up. If we had 100 things in our list on our application, we'd have to write that list element 100 times, but now we write it once and the application repeats it 100 times for us. And it changes it as the data itself becomes dynamic. All of our list items are held in one place inside of our app object. And I think the other thing is like you said, if you're working on a larger app like Rails, you end up breaking things down into little templates anyway, and start thinking about things in terms of like, how does the user interact with the front end? Well, that's kind of what JavaScript excels at. So you can kind of switch your thinking.
And I think keeping that mentality across the board is very, very helpful. So when you have the idea of, I'm doing it super simple here, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, I have to load Node, and then I have to go do all these other things, and it gets complicated on the back end. If you can say, look, it's simple here, it's simple there, and my mindset is similar, and I like how you said thinking about how we develop from the front end perspective. That really, really helps, because now your back end is as simple as your front end is as simple as the back end, and whether you're looking at it from either perspective, you can just look at the code and say, I get what they're doing here. Yeah, I think it's always been the hardest part. I'm very, very new to the I'm going to look at other people's code on GitHub and see if I can help out. And it's just like, you'll see stuff like, okay, this is simple. What is this? Like, all of this is just bad.
Method. Or it's like one line, but it's 300 characters and it's a bunch of function calls and links, and you're like, yeah, I don't know what to do with this. Yeah. The simpler you can keep your code, the more likely you are to get help with it, is also a really nice way to think about it. But I would say that, I started out with Ruby and Rails, and I like JavaScript. I'm interested in it because it's sort of like, to me, it feels like the Wild West. Like, it's just starting to figure out some standards and kind of set some baseline requests of other people. But it's been around for so long that there's like so much ugly JavaScript code out there that just needs help. And I just think it's like a really nice kind of switch from a more practiced language and framework. But Lineman gives you a little bit of support if you're from that background to kind of get a sense of, okay, how do I develop in this programming language?
Nice. Well, I definitely enjoyed the demo, and I will definitely be reaching out to you the closer we get to Halloween. I got some kids I can probably dump this on. Say, here, go to this website.
We can push it up on Heroku real quick.
There you go. So,
right, cool.
So everybody, I definitely want to thank you for tuning in to another Saturday discussion. And I am not going to reveal anything, but we've got so many big things coming up, so many big changes. I'm so excited, not just for the Saturday discussion, but for Code Newbie in general. And if you want to learn more about what we're doing at Code Newbie, you can check it out at codenewbie.org, or you can follow us on Twitter at Code Newbies with an S. I've been giving somebody like a bunch of follows by mistake, so I definitely had to figure that one out. And if you're interested in doing a discussion, join us on the Slack. We have our own Slack channel, and you can find that at our codenewbie.org website, as well as many different things for almost every programming language in mind. I joke around that, one of the programming languages I deal with at work is this old program called RPG. And I don't think we have a Slack channel for it yet, but I'm sure if you know what RPG is, you probably know some of the other languages that go with it, and I can almost guarantee you at least one of them is in the Slack channel. So I would definitely say check it out. We have a bunch of fun, a bunch of hijinks, and also check out our discourse. For those people that like the Reddit style without the Reddit. So it'll definitely be something for everyone to enjoy. So with that, everybody have a great day.
Have a great day. Nice to see you all. Bye.